Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and good afternoon to everybody that's watching this, whether you're on the West Coast of the United States, the East Coast, somewhere in between, or watching us from India as well. My name is Richard Rosso. I hold the Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. As you know, the India program at CSIS is very much focused on India's economic reforms and U.S. India commercial ties. And a lot of times when we talk about what's happening with the economy, most people sit back and sort of think first and foremost about how the large conglomerates in both of our countries are doing. The companies that are publicly traded, the companies whose names we know. But I think anybody that's dialing in for this call, and certainly our speakers, well understand that really at the end of the day, for a well-functioning economy, startups and small businesses tend to really become the lifeblood of an economy, creating jobs, creating new products, and certainly delivering the supply chain that's required for large companies to be able to thrive and succeed as well. So integral. Small and medium companies, startups as well, they've seen kind of an interesting environment, I think, in recent years. We know that even before COVID, there was a lot of stories and certainly some data to back it up that we'd seen, kind of a generational shift in supply chains that began to mount. I think most notably, as companies began to look to rely a little bit less on China as kind of a regional base of manufacturing, but also other markets began to see transitions as well. And what's the role that startups and small businesses play as large companies look to alter supply chains? But then COVID hit, and I think COVID's impact on startups and small businesses too has had very unique challenges that is presented to startups and small businesses. And it's terrific to have a great expert panel here to discuss how supply chains have evolved, the requirement for startups and small businesses as a need for larger firms, and the kind of things that governments and nonprofits can do to try to make sure that this a little bit deeper valley of death that we're facing right now isn't quite as bad as it ordinarily would be. And also, I want to thank everybody for dialing in today. Obviously, there's a huge election underway, expected to shatter all kinds of records for voting. I'm talking, of course, about Bihar, and we'll see whether or not the Nitish Kumar government manages to remain in office. Kidding, of course, November 3rd is our big day in the U.S. election. And again, for our American friends that are dialing in today, I'm sure this is a kind reprieve from those phone bank calls you're getting, the emails and everything else regarding the election. So we'll give you about 45 or 50 minutes where you can take your mind off what's happening politically and start again to think about the roots of the economy. So I've got three terrific speakers that are joining the discussion today. Dr. Vivek Lal, who is the Chief Executive from General Atomics Global Corporation. Vivek's been a friend of mine for well over a decade, and I've known him through many different avatars, through his time with Boeing, with Lockheed Martin, with Reliance. And he's always been known, I think, in policy circles as one of those really terrific technocrats that understands the engineering background to what we're discussing, but can break that down in a way that policymakers very much understand. So Vivek, it's great to have you on here. Also, Anjali Bansal, founder of Avana Capital. Avana really helps growth companies begin to scale up, and has also been an advisor to Niti Aayog on women startups and businesses. It's terrific to use that kind of business experience that she has to really help others to grow as well. So takes time out not just to work on her own investments and business, but really help others as well. And of course, my great friend Samir Sath from the Wadhwani Foundation, who runs Wadhwani Advantage, which helps small businesses really begin to scale up and take off. Samir also long experience in the private sector before deciding that he's going to take all that expertise that he'd built up from decades in the private sector and really channel that through the Wadhwani Foundation to help others to grow, learning the things that of course, he's understood well from all of his many years working in the private sector. So three terrific perspectives, I think, to look at the role that small businesses and startups play in growing and changing supply chains and helping them survive through COVID. Let me first hand the floor over to Vivek. And again, thanks, Vivek. Early morning on the West Coast, and really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you this morning. And Thank you, Anjali and Samir, to be part of this panel. And I look forward to the discussion. So it's a very interesting topic and a very important topic, uh, given the current situation globally in the pandemic. And so I look forward to this discussion. The micro, small, and medium enterprises obviously play an indispensable role in triggering economic growth and equitable development. The way I see it, their business activity is generally performed closer to the stakeholders, allowing them to be the first-hand recipients of expressed needs. India's aspiration to become a global manufacturing powerhouse and the government spotlight on Make in India also compels nationwide supply chain reform, prompting several federal and state-based schemes and investment incentives. So as MSMEs play a vital role in that growth by contributing, from what I understand, 45% of industrial output, 40% of exports, employing 60 million people, creating 1.3 million jobs every year, and produce more than 8,000 quality products for the Indian and international markets. So clearly, yes, MSMEs are a fountainhead of several innovations in manufacturing and service sectors. Um, this sector that we're talking about this morning in India is the second largest employment generator after agriculture and acts as a breeding ground for entrepreneurs and innovators with considerable support in strengthening business ecosystems. The estimated number of MSMEs in India is 63 million and employs, as I mentioned, many million people. Um, so I think MSMEs are exposed to a higher level of integration with global value and supply chains and are playing quite a critical role in global trade systems. Um, Data from 2019 that I've seen shows that the sector contributes about 29% to the overall GDP. Various reports, and if you look at surveys and other researches, that proved again and again that this sector does act as a catalyst for socioeconomic development of the country. And many of these aspects are true not only in India, but in the US as well. All this, of course, becomes more important with the Indian government's new mission of achieving the $5 trillion economy targeted by 2025. Within this target, the sector, of course, is going to play an important role with expected contributions, as I said, of very great percentages to the GDP. Of course, we are all aware of COVID-19 and how it has had an impact to industry at large, but certainly also on MSME owners, employers, and external stakeholders in these unexpected times. And so the impact, of course, is on supply of finished goods, the procurement of raw materials, and availability of employees to work in production and supply processes. And so as a result, there are various challenges, including debt repayments, wage, salaries, statutory dues, etc. Again, the earnings therefore have been impacted, and I do think we're coming out of that, as I was briefly talking earlier to the session. Um, but there is no doubt that MSMEs are the backbone of the world economy. Today, 95% of companies across the globe can be counted as MSMEs, accounting for 60% of the world's total employment. So this is a very important topic, not just for any specific country, but globally. So as a result of the current environment, some of the challenges that I see in the MSME sector include, for example, freeze in external funding, immense cash crunch, falling credit worthiness and ratings, um, lack of recapitalization, fear of shutting down, um, catching up with the online and digital race that's all around. And so certainly these are areas that are of concern and therefore, but have to be addressed. And I'm quite encouraged. Just briefly on the India-US relationship, I mean, India and US have been natural partners, industry to industry, including MSME. And we've seen an exponential rise in that marriage. In fact, in the defense sector, there has been a catalyst for growth in U.S. India ties. And trade, as you know, has increased from a couple $100 million at the turn of the century to approximately 20 billion now. So there has been considerable traction. The government policies have been very conducive on both sides to encourage this. I'll get off the stage by mentioning a few areas which I think are worthy of discussion and thought. But as corporations look at, large corporations look at MSMEs, there are certain aspects that come to mind. The first one is the skilling and the training of the MSME workforce. That's very important, and sometimes the reskilling, depending on the situation. The second aspect is innovation. I think a lot of R&D and innovation can be driven into the system through MSMEs, and I'd like to point out academia have a great role to play here on both sides. And finally, as in all business, there are three important factors that one looks for in terms of stability. One is transparency. The second would be predictability, and the third, accountability. And these are factors that are looked at in all corporate boardrooms, but certainly as one moves forward, these are three elements that will be particularly relevant in the MSME sector. So with that, Rick, I'll pass it back to you.
Good, some good data and some good thoughts to get us teed up here. Anjali, the floor is yours. Thank you again for joining.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. Pleasure to be here today with CSIS and old friends, both Dr. Lal, Vivek, as I call him, and Samir. So, and I look forward to actually learning a lot through this discussion as well. I think MSME is a topic which in regular business as usual times, we don't think about as much. And I think, Rick, you described it so well. This is actually the lifeblood of most economies, including India's. In India, particularly, our entrepreneurial culture is so deeply embedded in the DNA, and that actually is represented in the MSME space. It is one of the largest employers. One lesser known factor is 80% of MSME commerce is actually with each other. So while MSMEs form part of large supply chains for large corporates and so on, a lot of the work they do is actually with each other. It's one of those segments that has been slower to formalize. India has been going through a fairly dramatic and accelerated digital journey over the last 5 years with UID and Aadhaar and UPI and payment systems. And of course, with Jio's sort of fairly ubiquitous mobile network now. So data access is a reality today, not a possibility. And yet the MSME space in some ways has been slower to formalize and digitize and come into thus formal systems be more discoverable, whether it comes to market access or to credit access. And I think COVID, we started seeing the impact on supply chains, and I know we'll come back to supply chains later in today's conversation, well before COVID actually came to India. So we started seeing in large companies supply chain interruptions all the way starting from January and starting to think about how do you localize and onshore, nearshore, securing your supply. And the question of MSMEs, particularly that, if you want to bring manufacturing into India, you have to really sort of unleash the power of the MSME space. So that coupled with the digitization, formalization, and again, what COVID has done is accelerate digitalization across enterprises, is while yes, there are continuing issues of formalization, we are also seeing some generational transition taking place in MSME. So, typically your traditional traders, wholesalers in India, for example, and as is the case, I know in the US as well, that have done business in a certain way, as generational transition takes place, their children or grandchildren may not want to do that same kind of business, or at least in the same kind of way. So some good forces at work here: digitization, so acceleration of digitalization, somewhat sort of generational transition and the desire to formalize. And so consequently, we are seeing a couple of trends emerging. And Vadhani Advantage, of course, does some absolute yeoman work in helping build capacity in MSMEs, particularly when it comes to innovation and digitalization. So that is a very positive trend. The other trend is a recognition that without formalization, MSMEs may actually get left behind. And as we have discussions with whether it is in the government is actually putting together some very, very interesting programs as well. But whether it's conversations in the government, in the policy space, or with MSME associations themselves, there is this sort of now deep felt need to both formalize and scale. So I will pause there, and I'm sure we will come back to this later in the conversation.
Great. Well, Samir, you got a nice intro from Anjali about the work that the Wadhwani Foundation is doing. So let me throw it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Rick. And first of all, thank you for inviting me here at this very important topic to discuss. And I'm particularly happy because of esteemed colleagues of mine sitting on the panel, Anjali, Dr. Vivek Lal. And this is an incredibly important topic in the current times, especially given where we are surviving through COVID. So very quickly, I think just to sort of set the stage from my perspective, based on what I have understood and what I think is incredibly important in context of MSMEs, the small businesses particularly. When it comes to India, there are three important factors. The one is that we have got to recognize that India has a long tail of micro entrepreneurs who are really small indeed. So if you look at really the pyramid of the Indian MSMEs that we have, we do have suboptimal, subscale, a long tail of MSMEs, which essentially means that in the times of crisis, especially the fact that we are suffering through pandemic, it's incredibly hard for these folks to be able to resurrect, respond positively, and really not only survive, but also thrive. So firstly, I think that structurally, we have got to realize that supply chain capability, or just being able to survive properly, requires some kind of scale, some kind of size, which India lacks. The second part is really in terms of how the generations of the family businesses that really govern these businesses are tuned in their thinking. And it is interesting, I would like to sort of cite here, and this is a classic example that we are going through in COVID, in crisis times. One would imagine that really the collaboration should take place, the partnership should take place, because resources are getting thin now. And you're going to have tremendous problems at hand in terms of the resource mobility, in terms of money, in terms of time. We know that globally, right? But what you would witness, and I'm seeing that day in and day out, is essentially in the initial period in the crisis, people are actually fighting with each other more. And what that means is that there is an effect that takes place when there is a scarcity, fear, there is anxiety. Actually, these family businesses are fighting with each other. And that's really hard to digest, because in the periods of crisis, one has to cooperate with each other. And I think you've got to understand the psychology here of these family business entrepreneurs when they really think of this crisis, when their survival is at stake. Especially when it comes to supply chains, you've got to realize that globally as well as in India, 3/4 of the value that is created in supply chains is because of partnerships. And when you're dealing with this sort of mentality, psychology, you've got to realize that they are suffering from this, and therefore to actually forge partnerships right now is hard. So that's the second thing. And I think the third thing, really, if you really look at what these guys are going through, we are also suffering at the macro level, the collapse and the fracturing of the trade relations, right, that are happening at the country level. So if you think of the domestic economy, we all know that Indian economy has had contraction. In the Q1, it went down by 25%. In Q2, it's going to be down. We might end this year, 2020, anywhere between, my estimates suggest anywhere between -5% to -12%. And in that situation, domestic economy is down, the trade relations across the borders are a problem. Even the export economy, the export relations will become an issue, right? So in the short term, I see a lot of churn. I see a lot of fighting for resources. In the medium term, when it comes to 2021, I see there is going to be some semblance of normalcy that we will see sometime around Q2, Q3 in 2021. And that is where we will get to see whether the Indian MSMEs are really playing an important role, because as Anjali mentioned, a lot of the trade happens between them. So when you're looking at an ecosystem, they might really forge good partnerships and help each other. But the real question to ask is really, how as an ecosystem between the large players and the small players is going to really survive better. So these are the kind of sort of initial thoughts that come to my mind when I think of this topic. We'll of course discuss a little bit more later.
Well, great, great. Well, before I open up to the audience for questions, I've got a few questions that I want to ask the panelists. For each one, I'm going to have a specific panelist that I'm targeting the question to. But let me just say, for the other panelists, if you have something you want to add to the topic I brought up, just raise your hand or flash or something like that real quick, and I make sure I ask you the same thing as well, because I know you've all got a lot of great thoughts to add. But let me start off with Vivek. Thinking about large companies and this evolution of supply chains. When you think about that important MSME network that supplies a large global firm, you've obviously got experience in a lot of large global firms. When you think about investing in a place like India to do large scale manufacturing, and you think about all the suppliers, is it a comforting factor when you've got MSMEs you recognize that are in market already, your global partners? Or is it a relatively straightforward thing to find local partners that can kind of fill those needs as well? So talk about the importance of India attracting, the suppliers to big firms as well in order to attract the big companies. Critical or, somewhere in between?
Yeah, in my experience, that's a great question, Rick. In my experience, it's critical. I think presence in country is critical, establishing a footprint, establishing procedures and processes that company is familiar with, scoping out the ecosystem. And so, yeah, my general view is that it is very important for the supplier network, if you will, to indeed have presence, to have engagement at the various levels. And as you know, in India, there are various corridors and various states that have various incentives depending on the sector we're talking about. And so an engagement not only with the industrial base that exists in the MSME sector in India, because there's some great pockets of excellence. And that is something that only can be really completely unearthed if the MSMEs from the U.S. have that exposure and that presence. So I would be one to strongly advocate presence in India.
Let me just ask a really quick follow-up to that, Vivek. Just a few weeks ago, the government of India finally lifted the FDI cap to allow clearly state that foreign defense companies can become majority owned in India. When you think about the impact of that FDI cap change in defense, is that really targeting the big companies, or is that more of a door opening for a lot of the small and medium companies in defense that may become suppliers, or is it related to both? Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's across the board. I think it's a great policy to be able to have that flexibility on a case-by-case basis, whether large or medium or small company, to be able to then operate in an environment where they can feel free to put the percentage investment at whatever suits their particular stance. But I do think that's across the board.
Great. Samir, you mentioned about integration and global India's kind of openness to trade. With the companies that you have the opportunity to engage with, do you find that a lot of small and medium companies in India, relatively early, are thinking about global integration, or is that something that you need to try to drag them and pull them towards? Talk a little bit about how the world looks from a small business that you might sit down and engage with in India.
Sure. So as far as my experience goes, especially in the recent times, I would say in last 1 or 2 years, what I've discovered is that most of the Indian small businesses tend to think first in terms of the domestic economy. I don't think they're wired to think globally, suddenly, unless they're set up as export houses. So I think what I discovered in certain sectors which are a little more tightly integrated with the global economies, let's take automotive components, for example. Let's take certain tier 1 component manufacturers who, by virtue of what they have been doing for years, and it's a little more evolved sector than some of the other sectors, there you would find a lot of the thinking right now going on in both domestic sort of market as well as global market. What are the trade relationships they should forge? What are the kind of changes that they should make in terms of the key accounts they want to serve? Do they want to serve mainly the European OEs or the US OEs, or what kind of trade relations they should have when they think of aftermarket? These are the thoughts that basically run across their minds. But by and large, if you look at the majority of the large Indian MSMEs, they are today very inward focused, very domestic market focused, because we have got to realize that the reality right now is that we are basically looking at an existential crisis of anywhere between 1/3 to 1/4 of Indian MSMEs. We have 75 million. Any estimates, you can take a guess as to what kind of survival anxiety do they have at this stage. In the current, therefore, mindset, they tend to think more in terms of domestic market, except for a few sectors, like I mentioned, automotive.
Anjali, let me ask you something that kind of echoes from that, and some of what Samir brought up before. You who has investments in companies looking for new ones too, when you think about the evolution of supply chains, about global companies that are maybe drawing down a bit from China, looking to Vietnam and other places, do you think that India has been able to take advantage of this opportunity right now, or the things they should do? For companies that you're investing in or have already invested in, is that an important thing to consider? Are they looking to be global or to be globally integrated, or is domestic growth really sort of enough for a lot of companies that you look at right now?
So permit me to actually respond to this on two tracks. One is with the investor hat on, and Avana invests in companies that use sort of largely technology-led innovation to create large-scale change and impact. So for the most part, our companies, while they may start in India, and for the most part, those companies are actually using it. For them, India is the core market and domestic market. These are more startups and startups at a growth stage. They're not your classical MSMEs. But that said, there's a lot of enterprise tech that is now coming out of India and going global. So you are building in India for the world, very much the case. And we are looking at companies of that nature as well. They tend to be a lot more integrated in some ways into the global flow of information, technology, and capital and people. So there is less risk of their getting left behind. The second track that I want to actually address specifically to supply chains is I also sit on the boards of several large companies. And for the most part, there is a significant reliance on a global supply chain. And, we've all in business spent the better part of the last 20, 30 years thinking about core competency and just-in-time inventory and global supply chains and so on and so forth, right? So most supply chains now are quite globally integrated, even if it's a small component or a widget that you're getting from China. 70% of APIs in pharma come from China, for example. And similarly, so what happened with COVID, and as I mentioned earlier, is even before COVID came to India and the lockdown happened, we were starting to see interruptions in movement of ships and ports and hence components. And then, of course, India went into a complete lockdown. So even things that were being manufactured in India for global supply chains, those things got interrupted. But there has been a significant shift in the boardroom discussion and a focus on supply chain and the need to actually focus on vendor development, which to me is very positive for MSMEs that situate themselves and position themselves to take advantage of it. So what do I mean by that? Samir, you mentioned auto. I think auto in the OEs around the world and including in India have actually probably got one of the best developed vendor ecosystems. So they have invested heavily in developing their own supply chains, and both with technology and capacity and capital. That has not been the case necessarily in other industries, but I'm starting to see that shift take place. So big companies will invest, not just equity, but they will invest with technology, with resources, with knowledge, and with business, with revenue, to MSMEs to create a better, more sophisticated, consistent, and reliable quality MSME vendor base. So that's one. Second is they're starting to lend to their own suppliers, either directly or through other intermediary partners. And this is where I see the innovation and the startup ecosystem actually come together with big companies and with MSMEs. We have seen an absolute growth in business and the number of startups that are now focusing on formalizing MSMEs. So startups that formalize their accounting systems, for example, or the general ledger systems, or inventory, or create marketplaces for MSMEs to trade with each other. I won't name names, but these are now sort of household unicorns in India. We are also seeing the setting up of digital infrastructural rails supported by the government for creating better access to credit for MSMEs, as well as, again, facilitating this discoverability for business and market access. What do MSMEs need to do? Because this cannot work only with large companies driving it or startups driving it or government driving it. There is a real issue around credit access and trust in the MSME space. A lot of banks and NBFCs have seen their MSME portfolios actually have very dubious quality in terms of risk over the last many years, and not just COVID. COVID has just sort of highlighted the issue. So MSMEs will have to step up, also in creating more transparency, investing in technology, and getting away from doing business the way we always did it. You know, MSMEs have, and I'm making it a little bit of a general stereotype, but there is a traditional way of working, which I think the world over is changing, certainly in India, and MSMEs will have to embrace that. More transparent, more innovation, more investment, and thus formalizing and becoming a more reliable, consistent quality partner.
And Rick, if I may chip in, just to sort of add to what Anjali mentioned, there are a couple of points which are important. What I'm also witnessing is that there is, before COVID, if you look at some of the stats, 1 out of every sort of 10, small enterprises really wanted to have a digital access. I see that changing post-COVID in the last 6 or 7 months. It's 1 out of 6, right? So that's quite an impressive increase in terms of the level of interest, and not only interest because of the curiosity or you're going to do it because otherwise you're not going to survive, but I see that as a sustained interest, and which is a good sign. The second part is the way I look at it is the other part, which is market access, is what I'm witnessing as a very, very important trend. And more conversations that I have with SME entrepreneurs, I think they are deeply, deeply interested in looking at the platforms as a vehicle for them to be able to increase the business. And to me, I think that's also a very good sign, because I would see that emergence definitely going up in the next few years. And given, I think, if you look at the trade sort of character, the way it is happening, probably you will witness more of the regional trades. So let's say Asia Pac and Europe and then US, for example, as opposed to really across the continents. The way I look at it is, I think there is going to be a juxtaposing of the trade within the country as well as the trade within the nearshore nations that any country has. So I think that's probably what I'm witnessing and what I'm hearing and what I'm learning from the SMEs daily.
Oh, thanks. For folks that want to throw questions in, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. A couple of people have sent me questions directly, which is okay too, but it's a little bit easier to kind of keep track of questions if you log it in the Q&A thing at the bottom. Let me just ask, I got a couple more questions coming to me too, but that's okay. I got a couple of other ones to tee up for the panelists. Let me start with Samir. We've already touched on some of the weaknesses maybe that COVID has kind of exposed. How do you broadly characterize what's happening? Is it weaknesses that were maybe there that were augmented by COVID, or has COVID presented kind of a unique challenge? Is some of this things that maybe should have been thought of and considered even beforehand, or is it all just brand new and kind of that fat tail experience that nobody could have really sort of predicted and expected?
No, actually, it's a good question, and that reminds me of one of the things that I would sort of look at this as equivalent to what is happening in trauma centers. So, if I really look at in Indian healthcare, those organizations which built the trauma centers much before the trauma hit them actually survived that better. And even in Indian MSMEs, I see 2 distinct groups. The first group is where they have actually anticipated some of the disruptions that we are going through in COVID much before COVID hit them. And you will see, and in 2019, when the Indian GDP came down from 7.5% in Jan, the first quarter, to 4.5% in the last quarter. And in that period, you actually saw many of the SMEs in this bucket build the resilience much before the COVID hit them. So what COVID has actually done is it has sort of surfaced a lot of the inefficiencies right now. And I'm of the view that Indian MSMEs probably would require consolidation. So it's a way of sort of churning a lot of the inefficient SMEs that exist today in our ecosystem. And like in biology, you have a carrying capacity, and if your carrying capacity of a system consists of inefficient entities and units, there is a compromise in the system performance, and that's exactly what is happening to Indian ecosystem right now. I would imagine for those who actually built that resilience much before have done far better. In fact, our estimates suggest that they have actually clocked 3 to 5 percentage points more EBITDA levels than those than those who did not actually build that capacity before trauma hit them. And 3 to 5 percentage points in EBITDA levels is actually quite significant for an SME or for a small business. And that's what I would say is happening right now as far as the COVID is concerned. And therefore, you will see only few emerging, really thriving and surviving and growing, those who have built those resilient systems much before the crisis hit them.
Got it. Got it. Anjali, let me throw a question over to you regarding state governments. I think as a lot of people that are logging in know, the program that we run here at CSIS is extremely closely focused on state level policies in India, just because, of course, that's where push comes to shove and a lot of actual things, either do or do not happen. We've seen state governments do things like announce startup policies and programs, like zero window clearance, where startups can basically begin operating for a certain period of time, even before they get government clearances and things like that. Wonderful things to see kind of published and on paper and that kind of thing. But how do you see it in practice? Do you see that state governments really are trying to compete to try to create better ecosystems and win investments from startups and things? Or is it still a little bit too much paper and a little bit not quite enough in practice?
Well, you see, India has now got sort of multiple and quite well-developed startup hubs. The three biggest hubs for startup activity are Bangalore, of course, Delhi NCR, which is the broader Delhi area, Gurgaon, Delhi, Noida, and then now the sort of Mumbai-Pune belt, if you will. In addition to this, we see clusters emerging in Chennai, in Hyderabad, actually interestingly now in Jaipur. I'm conscious that our startup space is slightly different from MSME and particularly the micro entrepreneurs as well. Most state governments today have policies in place, stated policies, as you mentioned, Rick. They also have several states actually now run incubator programs with varying degrees of success. Some of them are actually quite successful. Hyderabad has T-Hub, for example, that is supported. Mumbai does, Maharashtra and thus Mumbai does some interesting work in fintech and so on, given that the regulator is here. I think that there is always a balance that, of course, as startups and business people and entrepreneurs, they would want to have no paperwork at all. And when it comes to government and bureaucracy, and those systems would want to have a lot more checks and balances. So I think that balance is still sort of underway, if I might put it that way. For MSMEs particularly, the more traditional MSMEs, there's a lot of sort of schemes that come out on financing from both public sector banks and other institutions. Some of them are sectorally focused in agriculture, say NABARD and so on, or a SIDBI plays a big role in financing SMEs. Micro entrepreneurs, I think in some, unfortunately, they tend to get left out of the net because they neither hit sort of the MSME type or SME type sort of cohorts when it comes to risk underwriting, nor are they real startups. So they kind of get missed out.
Yeah, that's a fair point. One that we don't always remember is the MSME involves a lot of different characters with different levels of growth and appetite, even sometimes. Vivek, of course, we always have a lot of folks from the U.S. Government community and policymakers that are involved with our work and our events here. So I wonder if you can share some thoughts. I mean, when you think about U.S. India relations, and I think as we were talking about beforehand, the commercial leg, at least between our governments, seem to be kind of the weakest peg right now. Defense is moving, you've got good things on people to people, but commercial ties, has been a little bit difficult to try to move in a more positive direction. When we talk about startups and SMEs, is there a role, are there kind of programs or functions that the U.S. government can play to try to help India with the development of the SME network? Or is it something that just simply has to arise out of pure play kind of commercial decisions? So any thoughts on policy ideas that can go, or does it really have to be the commercial side?
Yeah, there are, I would say there are various elements to the creating that stronger foundation as we go forward. I think I like to categorize them in various stakeholder buckets, if you will. One is the political spectrum, and I think there's been a lot of synergy, a lot of over the last many years to create those mechanisms with the political will that exists between both countries. And so that would be one bucket of stakeholders that are engaged. The second would be both the bureaucracies and where you facilitate policy to enable the kind of development you're talking about. And that has been quite well engaged. The third is the industry piece. As you say, it's a function of the businesses and the growth of the businesses and what's in the best interest in a more, not just at a large company level, but also the medium and small company levels. And so the industry captains from both sides have been engaged and need to be continued to engage. The fourth aspect that I mentioned in my earlier remarks would be the academia, and they play an important role, I think, in informing not only industry but governments in terms of trends and what works and innovative schemes to take things forward depending on the evolving situation, for example, currently like the pandemic. And then the fifth would be the communications aspect of it in the media and the perception of how things are shaping into the future. So there are various stakeholder buckets, and I think they've all made tremendous progress over the years. But certainly there's a role for each of those buckets to continue to advance the agenda.
A question for Anjali, and I think Samir would probably have some thoughts on this too that came up through the Q&A line, is for micro entrepreneurs, how easy or difficult is it for them to go digital and maybe hit kind of global supply chains? Are there barriers to entry? You know, is some of it being swamped by large multinationals or India's large companies that are kind of dominating the airwaves? Or is it relatively easy for micro entrepreneurs, you know, to build a digital presence relatively early on? So Anjali, let me start with you and see if you have any thoughts. This one came on the Q&A line, and Samir, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so it's never been easier to create a digital presence now. There are multiple channels and platforms on digital. In fact, we are finding that for a lot of micro entrepreneurs, their first shop front is actually Facebook. So that's one channel. So it's never been easier, and I think it's getting easier as we go along. The cost of digital access is minuscule in India, so you can get onto the digital freeway, if you will. There are formalized payment systems. I think UPI has been a game changer when it comes to that. So you no longer need to have very cumbersome payment processes and so on. I did see a question around PayPal and so on, but I think UPI, it's ubiquitous now. The third thing is that there are now large startup platforms, whether it's a Udaan or a Meesho and so on. And I'm not sort of plugging for them. They're wonderful companies, have a lot of admiration. But similarly, there's Bulk MRO. There are a lot of companies that are facilitating MSMEs to get market access and thus be able to, in some ways, accelerate their go-to-market journey and reduce the cost of doing so. Fourth are merchant ecosystems, which the large e-commerce players are fostering and facilitating. All of them have very large, long-tail merchant ecosystems. So it's Amazon, Flipkart, Snapdeal, all of them. So consequently, if you are a MSME, whether micro or even a regular SME, absolutely not difficult to go digital anymore, and would urge and encourage to accelerate your own digital journey as much as you can, of course. And there are other sort of very positive externalities from it. It makes the company discoverable, both in terms of market access, but also for financing. You start creating a digital track record on payments, on transactions. And yes, while of course it makes you discoverable to the tax authorities also, but there are many other positive benefits. So I think there is no alternative to formalizing and going digital.
Samir, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. Quick 2 points. I think I'm in a complete alignment with what Anjali is saying, and my experience suggests the same. 2 points. One is I think there are interesting innovations also taking place. So the unit of your analysis is no longer a micro entrepreneur all the times. It could move to a cluster, and I see some other players looking at cluster economics, taking a view of the cluster, taking a view of the entire value chain together when you think of micro entrepreneurs. And that really changes the unit economics of many financiers, many sort of market access givers. One of our partners, Global Linker, for example, provides access to the traders and lots of traders which are micro entrepreneurs. So there are lots of distribution houses which are very small in nature, many of them in nooks and corners of India, usually don't have any visibility or discoverability, as Anjali mentioned. But with these mechanisms, I think there is a very increased chance for them to be basically be part of this entire value chain, get that access both on the demand side as well as on the supply side. And it's not only that, but there is also the platform creation, digital infrastructure for talent, right? So it's basically, you're talking about money, you're talking about goods flow, you're talking about talent as well. So I think if you basically look at this combination, then I don't think it's a matter of time before these micro entrepreneurs really join the bandwagon, actually come forth and come to the surface and really start enjoying the fruits of this digital infrastructure. But it will take some time though, but I can clearly see the signs.
Another question's come off the line, and maybe I'll ask Vivek to offer thoughts on this, and Anjali may as well. Intellectual property rights and process maturity. So when you think about global firms looking to engage or the ability for entrepreneurs in India to kind of step up, how big of a barrier and impediment do you think intellectual property rights are? And for large companies that might be looking to transfer technology to Indian partners, is that kind of a gating area? So do you see maybe a lack of investment from startups because of concerns about IPR? And for Vivek, let me start with you. Are the concerns about tech transfer issues because of IPR rules, or is that tend to get overblown sometimes? I kind of wonder, how real the IPR concerns are. Vivek, let me start with you on that, and then I'll ask Anjali the same.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rick. And of course, it's an important issue, intellectual property rights. But over the years, what my observation has been, it's that's just part of doing business globally, and all companies that endeavor to doing that have put in their own safeguards and their own mechanisms to address that. So, I mean, and from my standpoint, that's just part of the mosaic of doing business globally, and in terms of technology transfer and other things, that's at a business to business level, I have not seen that being an impediment from a structural standpoint. It's of course there are areas of technology transfer that where all those other stakeholders that I talked about in my earlier conversation have a role in it, but I don't frankly see it as an impediment.
Right. Anjali, what about you from the startup angle? Any concerns that you hear about India's intellectual property environment, or is it pretty much grow as you can?
So nothing sort of specific as such. I sort of concur with Vivek that it's part of doing business globally, and young companies, when they innovate and they create new technology and so on, I think if it is truly innovative technology and there is IP around it, yes, they do go and register their patents and so on and so forth. When IP regimes are different across the world, and there are some areas where they are more defensible and others where they are not.
Yeah, thanks.
Rick, if I may, I wanted to pick up on another sort of stream from a previous question. One of the other things I'm starting to see now is a focus on MSMEs from the large chambers of commerce. So for the large part, the Indian industrial bodies, the CIS, FICCI's, Bombay Chamber, and I'm involved with many of them, President designate for Bombay Chamber, for example, we actually have a very big MSME initiative in recognition of the fact that MSMEs generate employment and a lot of economic activity and need to be plugged in and fostered and supported. So for those who are listening in and have an interest in either their MSMEs themselves or thinking about various other resource bases, not just credit and not just sort of the market, but also ecosystems that can provide support and mentorship, I would put chambers of commerce and particularly Bombay Chambers very much there.
Yeah, okay. A question that I think I'll start with Samir looks at states. Well, I guess two questions kind of came out. One question came up on, we really, you see the national government in India announce programs for kind of COVID relief for companies. We haven't seen state governments announce these kind of packages, at least publicly. Are there things going on, pools of money that state governments are coming up with? Are there other programs to help small and medium companies survive during COVID. And I think on a related note, although I'm not smart enough to know it's truly related, is a question came up as well on subordinated debt. I guess some new policy related to that. So Samir, I wonder if you can tackle those couple of things.
Sure. So let me answer the first question. The way I read the situation right now, based on some of my conversations with some of the state governments, is that they are thinking through some schemes in terms of offering attractive debt or hybrid instrument money to the MSMEs, along the lines of what central government announced a few months ago. But I think currently the situation that you have in India is, on one hand, you have $400 billion deficit in terms of what needs to be financed to the MSMEs, and that's a massive amount. And on the other, you are facing basically non-performing asset levels anywhere between 4% to 35%, and that's a staggering number, right? So on one hand, you have this and debt sort of requirement, money requirement. On the other, the financing becomes a problem for a lot of the state banks, basically to mobilize those funds. So in this situation right now, I think currently right now the thinking is going on with the state governments in terms of how to do it, when to do it, what should be the terms of that money instrument, etc. But some thinking is going on at this point of time. So that much I can say. To address your second question, I would say the response to the subordinated debt right now is mixed, because the large amounts were kind of announced by the government. But when it came to implementation, really taking MSMEs really availing of those debt schemes and utilizing that productively, the response has been low. So the last I heard, a little dated information about 1.5 months ago, was that there was an offtake of only 30% or 33%. The remaining ones basically were looking at inching that up to 50% over a period of next 4 months. But the fact remains that the response has been mixed. Having said that, I think the lot of the situation right now is that the Indian MSMEs, and this is one of the things that I wrote in one of my articles about the debt trap, and we don't want really the good money to chase the bad money. And the point is that at this point of time, what they really are worried about is that whether Indian MSMEs are going to use that money to fund their debt or to really fund their growth at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, repayment becomes the most important thing, right? So I think that's the catch. So at this point of time, unless that question is resolved, I think situation will remain the same.
Oh, thanks, Samir. Well, we're coming up on the wrap-up period here, but let me thank our terrific panelists here, offering three very different perspectives on one topic that clearly there's a big interest in. Vivek with General Atomics, Anjali from Havana Capital, and Samir from Wadhwani Advantage. Vivek, I think, first started us off by talking about some of the things that large companies look for in SME partners: skills, innovation. Also, that critical point that SMEs, they live closer to consumers. So when you think about the importance, it's not simply, that they're employment generators and other things, but the fact that they're so much closer to consumers and the electorate, keeping them happy, keeping them growing, is important, not just for the economy, but also politically. Anjali, showed that some of the shifts that were taking place from the startups actually predated COVID. And so you may see an accentuation of some things, but talking about generational changes, do kids want to keep up the family business? I thought was an important thing that we all need to keep into consideration, that you didn't have a pre-COVID and a COVID. Some of these were actually things that transitioned through, and we're seeing play out now. Samir followed up on that by talking about the water looks kind of calm from the top, but the sort of fighting that they're seeing as everybody really fights for survival. And there's a real time and a place where companies, smaller businesses, can begin to work together. But right now, a lot of churn out there that's happening underneath the water. So three terrific vantage points, I think, from looking at this issue on what COVID's had impact on companies that sometimes are out the purview of government to government. So again, Vivek, Anjali, Samir, great thanks to all three of you for joining us today, and also to our many participants who joined the conversation today. And we'll see what happens with the U.S. elections and the Bihar elections, and maybe we'll catch up on a different topic after all the dust settles on those two important events.